So there's quite a lot to discuss today, administration-wise, because I feel we are now long enough into the module to really set, for example, the exam requirements, to set how the exam will be run, to make a few modifications to the outline of the exercises, and so on. So yeah, welcome. Great to see so many of you. I know there's a lot going around in terms of COVID and colds and so on, so I hope you're already past that, maybe, for winter. And so today I will talk a bit about assignment 3, which you're currently working on, and assignment 4, which has already been put online as well, which will be our first hackathon of 2, that is. And I think these hackathons are extremely useful because you don't just follow my instructions, but you have room to experiment and to also compete a little bit, right? To try out different things, to collaborate as well. That's very much welcome. Hello. So you're very much allowed to collaborate on the hackathons. So I will lose a few words about this today. And then I will talk about performance metrics, specifically for regression, and go into deep learning. So we cover the basics, a few basics of neural networks today, but then we will go through far more advanced topics very quickly over the next week or two. It's best to really be on it from the beginning, and if you have not heard about it before, then maybe you need some self-study as well to sort of tighten up these concepts. But okay, so there will be a lot of administration work as well. And just to recap, so last week we looked into climate change first of all, so the basics of climate change, and we looked at different global warming temperature data sets and why there's uncertainty, larger uncertainty as you would probably expect going further back in time. And more recently, this uncertainty is obviously reduced due to the number of sources, data sources we have available. We talked about how greenhouse gases in particular, but also aerosols, affect the Earth's energy budget, and how we can use this to detect and attribute historical climate change, and also try to understand what will happen in the future. So we also looked at some first plots of climate change projections, which will become more prevalent, I would say, after the Christmas break. And then also we looked into decision trees as sort of one of the building blocks of many ensemble methods. We looked at the CART algorithm to build classification and regression trees. And we had a look at random forest regression using ensemble methods like bagging or bootstrapping and feature selection and so on. And you're actually trying these out in worksheet 3. And then also we talked about voting, averaging, and all these strategies. And we also had a look at, and again, this is an optional exercise as part of assignment 3, if you feel that random forest isn't going far enough for you, to look into AdaBoost or XGBoost for more advanced methods in this sort of area. And these methods also, when you think about the hackathon already, tend to perform quite well in many hackathon challenges. So often people win Kaggle competitions, or so at least historically they have, using algorithms like boosted regression trees. So that might be worth trying, but who knows? We will only see after you've tried it. And so before I go into sort of new topics today, and also motivated by some observations I had during the exercises, I wanted to give you very important updates on not just what I put online. So you might be noticing that I'm recording this now. So this was feedback some of you wished, especially if they won't be here maybe for a few weeks, or if you're sick or ill, that I will try to put the recordings online, but I would still obviously very much appreciate if I don't talk to an empty room as a result of it. But okay, so I will talk about the exam, about as a result of moving this to an oral exam, the observations of the exercises, which seemed to me that many of you were quite stressed towards the end of these exercises. The worksheets became very long, and sort of the weekly cycle could become quite stressful. So we'll try to de-stress that schedule a little bit. And there's, I think some great replacements that are actually additions to the module rather than costing us content. So I will talk about this and then explain a bit more about the assignments. So looking back almost now at wildfires while you're still working on it, but I think the worksheet was quite self-explanatory, but then the hackathon is less so. So I will try to motivate this a little bit. And then performance metrics, and then we move into deep learning, and this will keep us busy for one to 2 weeks. Okay, so the exam I believe I asked you in the first week, so I will not try to survey this again. So it seemed like everyone was either equal to have a written exam or an oral exam. Some of you, if at all, some of you had a slight preference for an oral exam. And I think the numbers make it easy for us to keep it on a to not sort of cancel the written exam and instead do the oral exam. And it's planned to be, like it's typical at KIT, as I heard, 20 minutes roughly per person. And it gives us the slight advantage that we don't drag this module on for too long, but that you can finish the module and almost immediately have your exam. So this would be the last week of semester, is one potential period when we could schedule those appointments individually. But I'm also happy to extend this slightly further in time to the next week after the semester and so on. I know you are busy, I know you have other commitments, I know you have other exams, and the good thing is we have the flexibility here to spread it out a little bit. And if you will see these slides being uploaded, and I included a link to sign up for this oral exam. So I'm sorry, I heard that those of you who have already signed up for the written exam will also have to sign up for this exam and probably cancel the old registration. So just so you are aware. Now, in principle, in a written exam, I would like to test exactly the same concepts as in an oral exam, but why I like oral exams is because if I see that you don't know something, I don't have to keep asking you about it for another sub-question. I can just move on to the next topic and see if you know more. So I think that's usually shared by whoever is examined in oral examinations. But clearly the logic is anything that sort of showed up in the lectures or on the worksheets is potential exam material, and I think this module aims to be more conceptual than learning by heart. So this also implies in turn that there might be transfer questions to new problems, right? So it will not necessarily be exactly the same thing that I told you about, but sort of applying the concept to a different problem. But I could also ask you something quite directly from the module content. Now, what I should clarify is, because we've only got 20 minutes, I will not ask you to actively sit down and program a regression or classification or unsupervised learning algorithm from scratch. So it will be more qualitative questions. So I might show you a code snippet that you have to explain why it's wrong or what is missing or what might be the potential output, things like that. Okay? Any questions about this? No? Otherwise, always feel free to ask me. At best, is if you post to the discussion board so everyone can see that and obtains the same answers. Are there any major objections against an oral exam, I should ask? No? Okay. So then I hope you sign up. And now, partly due to changing to an oral exam, which is now on, we have actually 15 weeks this semester, which is sort of peculiar. It's now in the last week of semester potentially, or the week afterwards. I sort of thought again about how I could ideally prepare you and give you this sort of safety and security that you feel that you're properly prepared for that exam, even if you don't have another 2 weeks or so to prep for it. And this sort of aligned with my impression that the assignments, while the first assignments were supposed to be slightly longer than the later assignments, this weekly cycle of Jupyter worksheets could be quite tedious and strenuous. So especially towards the end, some of you just didn't get to complete those exercises, which is a pity, right? So I felt it would help if we could give you for the programming exercises 2 weeks to complete those, which might mean that I will not cut down the material as much for each individual worksheet, but that you just have more time to work on it. But the worksheets shouldn't be longer than what you have seen so far, if at all, even still slightly shorter, okay? Just to give you more time to fit it into your schedules. So I hope you can read this all right. If not, I've also put a PDF version of this online. But last week, we talked about ensemble methods. We are now here Deep Learning 1 and metrics. And I've just on Sunday evening released assignment 4, and you're currently still working on assignment 3, which we'll discuss on Thursday, right? Now to give you 2 weeks for the hackathon, okay, so this we will discuss only on the 7th of December. We thought about how can we fill the exercise classes in a way that it's still useful for you. And luckily, we have a few PhD level researchers in this class who take this module and work on very exciting topics, and they have agreed to give presentations in those slots. Okay, so you can attend and see what is currently ongoing in terms of machine learning, so projects that are already using machine learning applied to climate and environmental science, broadly speaking, or which are aiming in the future to use machine learning. So this should be a two-way benefit in the sense that you see current research and beyond what I'm going to talk about here, what my field of expertise is. And at the same time, those researchers have a way to discuss with you as well. So maybe you have great ideas, think about algorithms, give feedback. So it's also an opportunity for them to receive some feedback. And I think that's the best way of using it. And then there's also the shift that I moved everything with deep learning slightly further up, explainable eye further down, because I thought the deep learning concepts are particularly useful for Hackathon 1. And then there will be a dedicated worksheet on deep learning, which I release in week 7, and we will only discuss 2 weeks later, just before Christmas. Okay, so the main introduction of new concepts here is slightly de-stressing the Jupyter Notebook schedule and instead have research presentations on two of these weeks, okay? I would say more about this on the next slide. The other big addition is that because we have an oral exam schedule now, I thought it would be useful not just to have implementations and slightly tedious writings in Jupyter Notebook cells as answers, but to have theory worksheets as well of questions of the kind that you could expect to be asked during the oral exam, okay? So questions relating to the content, but theoretical in the sense that you can answer with a pen and paper, basically. And you're allowed to use a laptop for this still and hand this in as a PDF, or to hand in a written sheet in the exercise class, or to scan whatever you have handwritten. As long as it's readable, we can give you feedback. And the first of these theory worksheets will be discussed then, so this will be handed out just before Christmas, will be discussed in the first exercise after Christmas, which is on 11th of January. And then there will be a second worksheet on the more advanced topics later on, just before we get to the end of the module. So otherwise it should still be fairly much the same. One addition here, because I don't want to put additional content onto you just before the exam, is that the last 2 exercise classes will be used to once discuss the results of the second hackathon, which will be on climate model emulation. And in the second to last week, I will give, and this is a voluntary attendance, I will give an overview of recent industry examples where machine learning is applied to climate and environmental science. So especially weather forecasting has recently seen some interesting papers by Google, NVIDIA, and so on. I mentioned this in lecture 1 during the first week. But otherwise, it's pretty much still the same, apart from also leaving more discussion on if there are specific questions about the theory, stuff that hasn't been understood well. I could also use that slot in week 13 to partly address those questions. Is that clear? No?
In the very first lecture, you mentioned that there will be 11 assignments.
Yeah, very good point. I wanted to. Yeah.
And that we need at least 8 to be submitted. How has that changed?
Yeah, so because we have distressed the schedule, I could now, of course, be saying, well, there are a few exercise sheets, so I somewhat reduce that proportion, but I want to be, the exercises from my point of view are mostly an offer to you to practice those concepts, and clearly those exercise sheets will in some way feature in the oral exam as well, so it's worthwhile having a look at those in any case. The question is, when do you implement it, and do you come to the class to see the solutions, or do you submit, right? So I will keep it the same in terms of the difference between the number of assignments that exists and the number of assignments that you have to submit. So if we had 11, you can subtract number 2 of the number of assignments that you have to submit, which makes it now quite a small number of assignments to submit, admittedly, but as I said, it's to your benefit. So instead of, what was it, 8 out of 11?
11 worksheets and 8 should be submitted.
Exactly, so now it would be 6, including the theory worksheets. But I would still recommend you having a look at it if you want to sit the exam. Any other questions? No? Okay. So as I said, I put the schedule online as well as a separate PDF on the first page of the ELIAS website, so it's hard to miss. Okay, and I hope just this revised schedule will make it easier for you to keep up with the exercises and to really sort of think more deeply about what you're doing as well, and be less stressful towards the exam as well. Very much focused as well on giving you an idea of what to expect. So just to clarify, the 2 research presentation sessions will be then in the exercise classes during 30th of November and 14th of December. So given that we have these volunteers to give presentations, I would very much appreciate if you actually attend, right? And contribute to the feedback. Now, currently we are a bit unevenly split between the presentations, so if you would like to volunteer another presentation, especially for the 14th of December, for example, because you are working on a master's project and you would like to receive some informal feedback, because there will be no mark for this, right? It's just an opportunity, then do get in touch and we can sort of fit you in on 14th of December, as far as I can see. Otherwise, I will announce the specific talk titles when I have them next week for the 30th of November. Now, as I said, so you can see this in the upper right corner, I'm now recording these lectures, and I hope this will be for everyone's benefit and put them online. So you will find the recordings already for last week in the folder for week 4 under the lecture and exercise materials for that specific week. And if the recording goes right, also for this week. I say that last the last narrow statement is because last week I recorded 2 parts and the second part didn't fully record. I don't know, at some point the screen cut out and then eventually also my voice. So everything that I talked about, Ada Boost and XG Boost, is not recorded, unfortunately. I hope that this week this will be different. Okay, so let's now move to the actual material. Unless there are any more questions about the administration stuff? No? Okay. Otherwise, do, as always, post to the discussion board. So the learning objectives for today, I will give you some background on the wildfires exercise, even though I believe there is already quite a lot of material included in some of the questions. I especially hinted at you trying to understand the forecasting problem, so the predictors and the predictant. But then I will also give you some feedback on a molecule called ozone and why it's important for Earth's climate and the atmosphere, because that's relevant for Hackathon 1, which has now been released. And as I said, then I will talk about how we measure machine learning regression, in particular performance. And then I will finally go into the basics of deep learning. But as I said, we will run through these quite quickly. So if you are used to deep learning before, see it as a nice recapitulation. In physics, they are used to hear about the harmonic oscillator at least 10 times during their studies. You probably hear about neural networks at least 10 times during your studies. But afterwards, we will move through this quite quickly, especially next week, looking at more advanced concepts. Okay, so assignment 3, you should already be working on this or about to start working, because the submission is due tomorrow, right? But so I think there's a lot of background already included in the worksheet, and you should be able to do the exercise even without me introducing this here. But I thought it's nice to just highlight how important this topic really is. And for this, I basically borrowed slides from my good colleague and friend Apostolos Voulgarakis, who is one of the leading wildfire experts worldwide. So I will come back to him on the next few slides, but he's very interested in trying to understand what are the drivers of wildfires and how it affects the atmosphere and climate. And what you can see here is a multi-year mean from 1997 to 2014 of burned area fraction, globally distributed. Darker red colors mean more wildfires over a given area. What immediately jumps to to eye is that there's a dominance in the tropics of wildfire occurrence, but that wildfire is a global phenomenon, right? So you also see it at very high latitudes. Pretty much the only places where you don't see wildfires is in deserts and in regions where you have major land ice occurring. But pretty much everywhere else you do see wildfires from time to time. So they have a major impact on nature. Sometimes it's also beneficial, has an ecological dimension. But clearly every time it gets close to human populations or also animals living in those areas, you have serious impacts. And yeah, so it's a very serious threat if you live close to a high risk wildfire area, for sure. Now, one of the reasons why this has become more pressing in a way is, and this you have certainly seen in the news, is that there have been so many wildfires recently in highly populated areas or around highly populated areas that have made it into the news. So certainly there have been many different wildfires by now in Greece with very serious and tragic impacts. California repeatedly is in the news, so if you ever visited one of the Californian universities during summer, like Stanford or so, it's sometimes quite surprising how unlikely you are going to be to enjoy the sunny weather outside, given the air quality as a result of these fires. It can really be a major impact on, even if you're not directly affected by the fire, the air pollution from this can be very serious. And you've probably also heard about the wildfires on Hawaii and various other places in the world. And this is why there has been an increasing, so clearly there have been hypotheses to link this to global warming, but the message is somewhat more complex because a lot is also about land management and what happens to in specific regions. So historically, some regions have even seen a decrease in wildfire occurrence. So for example, the savannas have seen that. And understanding these sorts of discrepancies, clearly a warmer, potentially in many places drier climate can lead to locally increased wildfire risk. But other regions it might be different, or depending on how the landscape has changed, because landscape is hugely impacted by human factors. And as I mentioned before, in some ecosystems, it actually is important to have fires from time to time. So it's a complex ecology, but what we in this module probably mostly focus on is the impacts that it has on climate and people, because clearly if you have a wildfire that burns a potential sink of CO2 and at the same time releases CO2 to the atmosphere, which is concerning. And from what I've just told you, you know that the predictability is fundamentally limited. So I talked to a different wildfire expert, not Apostolos, a few years ago, and he said he did 20 years of wildfire modeling, and he said that all the bottom-up approaches of building fire models based on equations motivated by science have failed. They basically don't predict wildfires particularly well. So maybe that's an overfitting case of listening to one specific person, but he seemed quite frustrated that it's such a hard to predict problem. And this is why now the whole field, I think, moves more and more towards data-driven approaches and then reverse engineer those relationships. And machine learning plays a big role in that. And then there are a lot of knock-on effects of wildfires, clearly, that we also want to understand. For example, extreme air pollution and how it links to, for example, cultural aspects, ignition sources, and so on. And this is also what you explore in the worksheet. So to have a fire, this is why deserts are not a good place to have a fire. You have to have fuel, and that's typically vegetation, right? So to really have a large wildfire by definition, you need vegetation that has built up over time, right? And then, so there has to be growth first, and then there has to be an event, and the vegetation has to be dry enough, for example, for this to take the scale of a significant wildfire event. And this is how it's linked to weather. So weather affects vegetation, but can also be a source of wildfire, starting a wildfire, because this is intrinsically a stochastic problem. So this is, I hope, one of the messages you take away from assignment 3 if you go through it, that even if you have a high, so even a risk of wildfire is usually, in the majority of cases, not linked to a wildfire, right? So you can have conditions that are very prone for wildfires to develop, but in most cases there will be no wildfire, right? So that's the stochastic element of you need an ignition source of some sort, and lightning in the tropics in particular is often such a source of using the fuel built up to release the wildfire. But this is also where humans come into play. So with or without intent, humans are often the source of ignition. And again, it's to a certain degree at least a random element. But if you have more humans around, then the chances of someone screwing up basically increase, right? And this is why you need probably some variables related to human activity in a certain area to have this source of ignition. But humans can also have a positive impact. So sometimes land management can reduce fire risk. We've seen this maybe in some areas in Africa, for example. There are various ways of how this can happen. Changes in which vegetation is being grown, changes in vegetation being grown and keeping water at the surface, being sort of prevented from evaporating. So if you can bind more water at the surface, you reduce the seriousness of drought. And then also, the element of population in fire-prone areas, basically seeing an increased exposure over time. This is what makes it into the news. So and worksheet 3 is pretty much aiming at trying to explore these drivers and see how predictive they are of wildfires in a very simple random forest regression approach. Well, relatively simple. And maybe in one of the future worksheets we can build on this using explainable AI and recurrent methods for deep learning. Okay, so I don't want to spend much more time on this. So Apostolos, as I said, is an expert in this. So I linked a YouTube lecture that he gave. So he's partly funded by AXA. This is not meant to be a promotion for AXA insurances, but clearly the insurance industry is interested in this. And he gave a talk for this funding agency that was founded by AXA on YouTube. And especially if you watch these 10 minutes that I noted here, you will find more background, and everything afterwards is more detailed about how this is implemented nowadays in climate models and so on. So Apostolos is, for example, a founding director of the Liverpool Centre for Wildfires at Imperial College London, where I met him, and is now a professor at TU Crete, which is very nice for him because, well, he's from Crete originally. Okay, so this much about assignment 3. If there are no questions, I would move on to the hackathon. And the hackathon, in some strange way, combines 3 unlikely things, which is the molecule ozone, which you certainly have heard about before. Basically 3 oxygen atoms connected in a resonance structure here. Connects ozone, the UK, and climate modeling or Earth system modeling. So let me give you some background on this. So ozone is what I call a multifunctional molecule. It's one of the main reasons why we have atmospheric chemistry models in science. And one of the key reasons that sort of triggered the development of atmospheric chemistry models also for climate is stratospheric ozone depletion. So I'm pretty sure most of you have heard about stratospheric ozone depletion in some way before, and the ozone hole over Antarctica. And generally, the ozone layer has suffered from emissions of ozone depleting substances from the 60s roughly onwards. So there were certain chemicals that we didn't use before and that were then particularly useful, for example, in air conditioning, refrigeration, and so on, because of their inertness. But unfortunately, these chemicals contain halogen atoms, which are only released once they reach the stratosphere, where you have high energy and ultraviolet light of high enough frequencies to split those very inert molecules. And the tragic consequence of this is that the increased halogen content coupled to a number of quite complex chemical reactions can, under certain circumstances, accelerate ozone loss catalytically in a catastrophic fashion. And especially those conditions are met during springtime over Antarctica. So this is just illustrated here, which looks at sort of the integrated number of ozone molecules throughout the atmosphere, and blue means that you have very low number of ozone molecules in sort of a vertical view through the atmosphere. And underneath you can see Antarctica. So it's just one illustration of an ozone hole a few years ago. So ozone has, and why is this important? Because the stratospheric ozone layer, so the abundance of ozone, which is mostly, to a large degree, I think around 90% in the stratosphere, means that the absorption of ozone, ultraviolet radiation, UV radiation by ozone, makes life on Earth possible. Because there is, again, a narrow wavelength bands being only absorbed by oxygen and ozone in the stratosphere of solar sunlight, which would be so high energy if the ozone layer wouldn't exist, that it would strongly interact with DNA molecules, also RNA molecules. So everything based on DNA and RNA would be screwed. So we wouldn't be able to at least live on the surface of this planet if we didn't have the ozone layer. So this is why it's important. On top of this, ozone also absorbs in the long wave spectrum. So we talked about this with the Earth's energy budget. Long wave is relating to greenhouse gases. So it is a greenhouse gas, and as ozone changes in response to, for example, climate, this could amplify the greenhouse effect, the anthropogenic greenhouse effect. And then the very absorption of sunlight by ozone and molecular oxygen leading to ozone formation is key to the existence of the stratosphere. So if you look at the vertical temperature profile of the atmosphere, it's first, so surface is quite hot. Okay, this is where most of the sunlight is then absorbed. And then it's decreasing up to around, depending on which latitude you look at, 8 to 15 kilometers until you reach the tropopause. And then suddenly temperatures start to increase again, right, up to around 50 kilometers. So that might be surprising if you haven't heard about this before, but this is mostly down to the absorption of sunlight by oxygen and ozone. And then finally, and this is maybe how you came across it in a different way, hot summer days are often correlated with high ozone pollution. Again, a sort of chemical reaction, a chain of chemical reactions leading to that. So it's also an important air pollutant leading to health problems in industrialized areas in particular. And now why am I telling you all this? Because the assignment for the hackathon is all about predicting ozone. And what you will do is, put in very simple terms, learn a regression model that predicts ozone in grid cells of an Earth system model, in this case, the state-of-the-art UK Earth system model. And instead of using an atmospheric chemistry scheme for this inside UK ESM, which is what is typically being done, you will use substitute predictor variables. So I wrote a paper that is not up to date anymore for this hackathon, so there's a little value in looking at this for you to get the best possible tuning. But in this paper, I basically suggested using meteorological variables, in particular temperature fields of the atmosphere, coupled to a dimension reduction approach to learn a machine learning function that predicts ozone across the entire model system. So this is a regression problem you can solve, and as I showed, you get a fairly good approximation, but you will see the regression problem is slightly reformulated, and the question is, how good can you get? And again, what is the scientific motivation here? Fundamentally, what scientists try to do, looking into the future, climate change, and so on, is to try and model all the different processes that might be important on climate timescales. So the approach is very similar to weather forecasting. You have a numerical model that you integrate forwards in time, but now because you care about long-term processes and changes in the forcings, like CO2, like aerosols, you have to care about processes that are much longer scale, like atmospheric chemistry. Many of these chemical species have a certain lifetime of, let's say, a few months to tens of methane, for example, 10 years. They are all affected by these sorts of chemical reactions, or the carbon cycle, and so on. And now here on the right side, you can see a very simple, simplistic illustration of the numerical grid of such an atmospheric model. So it has been historically the case that many models were discretized because you can't solve these equations analytically, so you have to solve them numerically onto a grid of longitude, latitude, like you already saw in the exercise worksheets, and then also vertical dimension. So you have a certain number of cells, then also reaching up into the upper troposphere, stratosphere, often mesosphere nowadays. Now, I don't want to overcomplicate this. So this regular grid is still present in some of these models, but many modeling centers have also moved on to more complex grid structures by now. But still, the output is often giving on longitude-latitude grids just because it's easier to process. And you will get output from such a climate model or Earth system model for specific grid cells. Okay, so this is the data you will get, and you will learn machine learning models to predict ozone mass mixing ratios in this case, which is just a different way of expressing concentrations of ozone per given parcel of air, and you use as predictors the state of the atmosphere. And the reason why we would want to build or learn such a relationship is because predicting or modeling ozone in climate models is extremely computationally expensive. So these climate models, integrated nature, have to be typically run on supercomputers like Horeca here in Karlsruhe. So they are some of the most expensive computer models out there. And if you look at the evolution of these climate models over time, then on the left side, you see in the 1960s, the first atmosphere-ocean coupled general circulation models. So these were fluid dynamical models of the atmosphere and the ocean coupled to radiative transfer schemes to, for example, model the effect of changes in CO2 on climate. And this is Nobel Prize-winning work, right? So Manabe, the first papers from this period just a few years ago were awarded a Nobel Prize for this. And then this complexity of Earth system modeling has increased over time as we have increased scientific knowledge, but also computational power. So especially sort of end of 90s, beginning of 20s, 2000s, a lot of biological and chemical processes came into play. So for example, the carbon cycle and extensions of the cryosphere modeling, so ice sheets and so on. And what might be harder to see, so there's also been an extension to more and more vertical levels, so the upper atmosphere is given here, and as part of this, we have seen an extension of including atmospheric chemistry, which is necessary to model ozone in these models. And the reason why this happened so late is because atmospheric chemistry is a very large system of coupled differential equations, which adds not just a little bit, but quite significantly to the computational expense of the overall climate model. So when I first started looking into this, the UK Earth system model was slowed down by a factor of 2 to 3, and that's significant, right? So if you have to run a single climate change scenario for, let's say, 1 or 2 months on a supercomputer, then a factor 2 or 3 matters, right? Because instead of 2 months, you might be at 6 months, right? Just to get the results of a simulation. So the question is, can you basically include ozone and atmospheric chemistry in a model without having to model it explicitly using a numerical model? But could you use machine learning to take a shortcut? And again, I don't want to bore you now, but in those models, you can play the game of asking yourself how important it is to include these components in the first place, and you can run idealized climate change simulations, taking one model component out, in this case atmospheric chemistry, and run it without interactive chemistry. A top scenario here under 4 times CO2, which is one of the standard scenarios to test model sensitivities, compared to an interactive chemistry setup, and there are significant differences if you do that. So we want to include ozone, that's the bottom line. And this slide looks more complicated than it is. It's basically restating what I just said. So you have a very expensive but important model component. So it's always the question, is it worth the effort? And the reason why it's so expensive is because you have a large system of coupled differential equations, which has to do with the time dependency of chemical reactions depending all. So for example, this chemical reaction here produces ozone. This one consumes ozone. But this one also consumes odd oxygen, which is involved in this here, right? This reaction here, and oxygen is also involved in this reaction here. So you can already see that this becomes a time-dependent coupled differential equation system, which just blows everything out of proportion because you have 200 chemical equations to couple here, and the fundamental atmospheric equations, primitive equations, are a much smaller set of reactions in the first place. And taking the shortcut here, take this as a regression approach, was the suggestion in this paper a few years ago. But now what you will do differently, this has again to do with the structure of UK ESM and the parallelization, is to use a different set of, including temperature, but not only temperature, a different set of meteorological variables, including also, for example, chlorine content, which I mentioned in terms of the ozone layer being important for ozone depletion, or variables of dynamical nature, heating rates, and so on. These variables are explained in more detail in the actual worksheet. But instead of using a dimensional reduction approach, what you will be provided with is column information. So the idea is that you will focus on specific grid cells in these in the numerical grid of UKESM. So for example, let's say, well, the arrow is pointing right now, and then you will be provided with column information, so that these predictor variables across the entire atmospheric column for that sort of grid locations, right, including layers far further down in the atmosphere or far further up in the atmosphere. And this has to do with how UKSM is parallelized. So the storyline is somewhat more complex, but as you parallelize the computations, you will always have the column information available at runtime on a given processor, but you might not have the information available from a very distant, horizontally distant location. So this is why, if you want to parallelize this efficiently, we will use regression functions that work just based on column information here, okay? And you will do this, so this plot, if you have never seen this before, some of you I know have, because I discussed stuff like this with you, but this is just a cross-section through the atmosphere at a specific longitude, averaging ozone concentrations as a contour plot. This is mass mixing ratios, I believe, over 100 time steps of the UKSM model. And what you can see, and what is plotted here is sort of a cross-section of the atmosphere at a specific longitude from pole to pole. So -degrees here on the left side is the South Pole, in the center is the equator, on the right side is 90 degrees north, so the Arctic. And then you look from the surface, 0 kilometers altitude, to around 50 kilometers altitude. And what you can see is at around 30 kilometer altitude or so, you have this peak concentration in terms of mass mixing ratio. So most ozone resides in the stratosphere. And what you will do is to look at 6 different locations which describe very different chemical regimes. And the reason why I'm doing this, why I'm sort of focusing you on 6 grid cells, is because otherwise you will very quickly run out of computational power, because it becomes a very big RAM problem. But those 6 grid cells should be fairly representative of some of the regimes we want to sample. It just means that different predictors might be more predictive or that you need different setups, so to speak, different tunings of your hyperparameters for the different regression problems. Okay, so that much about the preparation here. What I want to tell you is, don't be frustrated if you don't have the perfect information available. So it's basically guaranteed that as you also visualize those time series that you're trying to predict, that the thing is, you don't want to overfit, right? So if you don't get a perfect out-of-sample prediction, then this is perfectly normal. You are building a model, and it will not be perfect. The big point is, can you build the best possible model that also generalizes well? And then clearly there will be a small competition, which we will measure using an objective metric. And I could have defined, I will come back to this next, in a variety of different ways, but we will use the mean squared error on data that you don't have available. So we will hold some data back that you will never see, and I will explain in the exercise in 2 weeks why this is important. Data you will never see, so you really want to make sure that your model generalizes well in an objective fashion. And as I said, you're very much encouraged to also submit shared solutions if you want to work in a group. Just submit your folder with your KIT IDs, U, Z, V, whatever, and then with different underscores in between so that we can identify you, okay? Because I think a big part of this exercise is to explore, to experiment, to learn from what other people are doing, to try out a range of different algorithms. Okay, so the assignment should be online. Do let me know if you can't access it, but I would recommend you have a look at it first. But are there any questions right now? No, I see just shaking heads, some just twinkling eyes. Yeah, but otherwise, as always, discussion board, or also when we have the research presentations, you're very much invited to ask questions afterwards if there's still time. Okay, so this much about the assignments. Now we could have a short break, or we could go on. Who is for a short break? 1. Who is against it? 3. Okay, let's have a short break. The majority isn't big enough. So let's have a 2-minute break, and then we'll continue with metrics. So if any latecomers want to claim their chocolate trophy for pointing out the Tsar access error, you're still welcome to claim that. So a few people had problems accessing the 2 meters temperature data. Yeah, sorry that you have to re-register.
I don't have to. They called me when trying to get to the
Oh, okay. Good. Thank you for the way. Yeah, 10 minutes time, because I just wanted to let you longer. It's not common implementations are not really about 10 minutes is probably what I thought is probably a good, so you can sort of motivate it, right? Show what you're doing, show what your next steps are, whatever you might want feedback on, or just give an input or message that you're using. Don't do 40 minutes talk or something. No need for that. But thank you.
is it normal that the first area is empty?
Okay, that must be. So can I just say again, there might be just one spot. If you use a different color scale, especially with this sort of map, it's very difficult to see. So maybe use something that is, I can make this general comment. Just if you're also trying to plot a burnt area for a specific time. So there was just a very important question concerning the exercise sheet to avoid confusion. Do experiment with different color scales if you try to plot burnt area. So you would like to have something particularly binary and shiny, right, on the edges. Because usually for a specific time step, it will be the burned area for that time step. And it's not burning everywhere, right? So there will be just maybe a pixel or so where you will see a burnt point, and it will be very hard to see if I project this. But if you plot a color scale that is sort of gradient white to blue, it might just disappear on the background of your land cover map, for example. So it's good to look at extreme color maps, which are linked, I believe, in the worksheet. I hope I did. So play with the color map if you struggle to see a burnt pixel. Okay, I believe we are all back. So let's move to the metrics. So are we back on board, everyone? So talking about metrics, I could get lost because it's partly a funny topic, but I will focus on regression because we already talked about ways to measure classification skill in the past. And there were just a few points talking about regression in the worksheet that I wanted to point out. That might be known to some of you, but I just want to make sure everyone is on the same page. So I'm pretty sure that as well that around 50% of you or so or more will have seen this illustration before, maybe 100%, which is on Korn's quartet, which is just showing you that it's very important to say that different data sets, right, if you try to find relationships also for your predictive skill, which is usually not correlating X against Y, but correlating Y hat against Y, right, your predictions, that you can end up with very similar relationships for mean, variance, or the correlation coefficient with which you might want to analyze those relationships, right? So the takeaway message from these sorts of plots is that it's usually a good idea to visualize your results. And in the walkthrough for the hackathon, I'm also doing this. And you will notice that most exercises where I put a demonstration, I also put a visualization, right? Especially for time series. I think that's very important because there is no single number or even two numbers that can necessarily perfectly characterize how well you're doing. So visual inspection is absolutely key. And there are funnier examples around. So if you are already aware of Korn's quartet, you can, for a given standard deviation, mean, and variance, for example, come up with quite nice ways to create data that shares those features. My favorite is still the dinosaurs here. There are even full Datasaurus packages in R nowadays that you can use to play around with these sorts of features. Now we try to solve the inverse problem, right? Instead of creating data sets that share a certain mean, variance, correlation, whatever, we are trying to find metrics that could distinguish those data sets in the best possible way. And I'm virtually certain that we are all on the same page when we talk about these standard metrics for measuring regression performance. So y hat is always the prediction, y is the actual value we wanted to predict for a given sample. So mean squared error is famous. You could also take the root mean squared error to bring it to the same unit scale as the mean absolute error. And clearly, if you take the mean squared error, you penalize somewhat more the extreme outliers. And this is sometimes a subjective choice that you want to make in your regression model, and this can change the solution you find as well. And you can change this quite easily in, let's say, grid search CV or on most regression functions, unless the cost function is specified as part of that. Now, in the exercise sheet, you were asked to also correlate using the Pearson correlation for paired data, and I think there was some confusion at times because classically how this is discussed on Wikipedia or so, you would usually have two so pairs of data x and y that you correlate in this way. And I think there was some confusion that if I ask you to evaluate your predictions, then clearly you can turn this around in both directions, right? But x, for example, would be y hat in this case. So instead, some of you correlated the predictors with the predictants, and that gives you a correlation analysis between the predictors and the predictions that might imply something for your predictability problem, but it doesn't evaluate your predictive skill, right? So just be aware of this, that if you read the scores on websites like this or in books like this, what you actually try to correlate here, right? An even more common metric when you use something like scikit-learn, or general machine learning packages for time series in particular, that's an important metric, is the R2 score, it's called in scikit-learn, or coefficient of determination, it's often called as well. But there are various coefficients of determination around, so the one that I'm referring to here is the one where you take this formula here, 1 minus the sum over the values minus your predicted values, so this would be your mean squared error again, divided by the average, by the variance basically in the data. And that's a relative metric that behaves very different to Pearson correlation, as you will see. And just to illustrate that point, I'm going back to the sine wave, which I used already 2 weeks ago, just because it's a nice example. We can do it in 2 dimensions. So in this case, you would have a relationship between x and y, right? And you would try to model this function again. So if this is your original sine wave, let's measure different ways of correlating the sine wave. So if you had something like this, right, where the blue curve is your model and the black curve is your true data, what would be the R2 score and Pearson correlation for correlating the blue curve with the black curve? Okay, and for this I believe I've prepared a quiz for you.